Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Chris from the Woodworking YouTube channel, Third Coast Craftsman, and I recently teamed up with Rockler to build this really cool live edge river top jewelry box. Has a lot of beautiful features, but in this video we're going to talk about how to make a live edge river top, either something small for a jewelry box like this or even a kitchen table. So it's going to be all sorts of great tips and tricks, so let's get started with that. And if you want to see this video on the full jewelry box build and all of its cool features, make sure you go over to my YouTube channel and check that out. Let's get started. One of the first things that I like to do on any epoxy river project, whether it's big or small, is to make the form. I usually will cut scrap pieces of plywood, 1/2 inch or thicker, but you can use particle board type materials like melamine or even UHMW. UHMW is expensive, but the epoxy doesn't stick to it and it's reusable. So if you're doing multiple of the same size tops or whatever epoxy piece you're doing, it's nice to use something like UHMW. With plywood or melamine, you're going to need to cover all the surfaces with sheathing tape. Tyvek's is a brand name of it, but the big box stores also carry their own version with their logos on it. Now I usually make my forms about 1 inch or 2 taller than the thickness of the top and then assemble the sides together first. You'll want the inside measurement of that form to be either 1/2 inch to 1 inch longer and wider than your final dimensions. This will give you some room to trim off the ends and sides to final dimension later on and get a cleaner, better looking edge. I leave the bottom of the form off so that I can use the sides as a template to lay out the boards and see what's going to look best. Once I like the layout, I can strike some lines with a pencil using the form and then cut those out. Here I have 2 individual boards, but most of the time you're going to take a single board, rip it down the middle, then flip the board so the 2 outside live edges are now facing the middle to make your river table. Then I'll cut the bottom of the form out. Now you can make it the same size as the sides, but I've begun to make the bottom about 1 inch wider. It makes it easier to get a good sealing bead of caulk all the way around the outside and inside. Lets you see any leaks a lot easier and address them before they become a big problem. And if the bottom is flush to the sides or actually set inside the sides and you get epoxy that starts leaking out, it's going to be a huge mess and a lot harder to address. That's why I like having that little lip now. Then I always will run a bead of silicone caulk on the outside and inside seams of that form. Epoxy really is good at finding any little holes and slowly leaking out and giving you a really big mess. So make sure you spend the time and get that sealed up perfectly. Then once the silicone is dry, I add my layers of sheathing tape, making sure that I overlap the seams to form a nice seal. I've tried using just melamine before and spraying on a releasing agent, but the only thing that I found that works besides UHMW is adding a layer of sheathing tape. Now I can cut out my pieces, and I just barely will remove the lines on these cuts so that they'll fit in the form without any problem. Since these are small, I'm using my bandsaw, but if you're making a table, you'll probably want to use something like a circular saw. I'm going to remove the bark and the cambium layer from these 2 slabs. Now some people want to keep the bark, but I'm not going to recommend that, and it's not very easy to accomplish for a river style project like this. The bark to wood bond usually becomes pretty weak during the drying process, and it's hard to ensure a good long-term strong bond that's going to be able to hold those pieces together. So I definitely recommend removing the bark and cambium layer to ensure you get a good proper bond. The bark can usually be chipped off in large chunks with a chisel or draw knife, but the thin paper-like cambium layer usually needs to be taken off with sandpaper, a spoke shave, or some sort of abrasive wheel until you're down to the sapwood. On walnut, the sapwood is really apparent and it's that lighter blonde-colored strip along the edge. In other species, it's not so obvious, but just make sure that you're through the bark and you'll know when you get to actual wood and you'll be good to go. I like to round over the bottom edge of the slab so that the caulk and tape that are in the bottom corners of the form don't prevent the slabs from seating flat to the bottom. Then I'll use a couple spots of hot glue and clamp the slabs down while that glue hardens. Hot glue is nice because it's sticky enough to hold the slabs to the Tyvek, but it'll still release easy enough later on. Epoxy is expensive and you don't want to waste it, so on larger tabletops, it's a good idea to run a bead of silicone along the bottom edge of that live edge and up the sides to help prevent epoxy from running underneath and to the back of the slabs. I don't do that here because this is a small little pour and I'm not too worried about wasting just an ounce or two. So I'm coating the edge with some of the casting resin. You can use pretty much any kind of epoxy for this. And the principle here is that I'm going to seal up this edge because I'm going with a clear pour. This isn't so crucial if you're going to color your wood, but a lot of the bubbles that end up coming out, you'll have bubbles from when you mix the epoxy together, but then you'll also have bubbles that appear from air coming out of the edge of the wood here. So if you can go ahead beforehand and coat this with a layer or two, I'll probably do 2 layers. I'll come back, I'll let this sit for about an hour or 2 hours, and then when it gets tacky, before it fully cures, I'll come and I'll add another layer. And then once that gets really tacky or almost set up, that's when I'll do my pour. So I'll still end up getting my chemical bond that I want. So the epoxy will bond to itself. I don't have to re-sand this edge, but it'll prevent any air bubbles from seeping out of that edge. Because what happens is the epoxy heats up. It's an exothermic reaction, causes a lot of heat. These thicker type epoxies, they're specifically designed for casting, pouring thicker in these river tables and things like this, so they don't heat up too fast. If you just took regular epoxy for like my boat, just your regular high performance epoxy, and you poured it an inch thick, it would burn up, get super, super hot. It would screw up the chemical reaction so bad that the epoxy would probably like swell and crack and end up being super brittle. You have to have epoxy that's formulated properly for what you're doing. So when you're spreading it thin like this for this type of pour, what I'm using right now, just either regular epoxy or the thick stuff. The thick stuff's going to take a lot longer to cure, the casting resin. That's why I usually will use a regular epoxy for the edges. Alright, so I blew this out, got it nice and clean. I have it downstairs. I'm down in my basement now, out of the shop, away from dust, because I don't want any kind of dust or anything falling in here. Plus it's a little warmer down here than it is in my shop. And what I did was I measured about 8 different areas across here, and then you take that average. So you divide, your average, you total up the sum of whatever it was, like 2.5, 3, 3, 3, 1.5, 2. Take all those and you get your average, which was 2.7. I multiplied that by 18 inches long and 3/4 of an inch deep, and that'll give me my cubic inches. And then you just go on your phone and find a conversion from cubic inches to ounces or quarts or whatever. So I got about 20 ounces. Now 20 ounces is up to about here on this. So I'm going to actually mix just 10 ounces in 2 different ones, because 20 up at the top, it'll be a little bit harder to mix that. I'll be able to mix 10 a little bit easier. Or if I had a bigger container, then I would just do all of it at once. But I'm going to just do it in 2 different parts, mix it really well. This is a 2-to-1. I'm using MAS deep pour epoxy from Rockler, and it's specifically formulated to be able to pour in deeper areas. A lot of times with epoxy, like I mentioned earlier, regular old epoxy, it's formula is designed so that it heats up and a thin layer so that it can cure. Well, this stuff, they formulate it, they tone down that exothermic reaction, that heat way back, so that it can be in a thicker form like that without burning itself up. So you definitely want to make sure you're using deep pour anytime you're doing a casting. So we'll go up to 3 with our part A, and then over to 3 on our part B, and that'll give us our 2-to-1 ratio. I lied, it's 3-to-1. I'm sorry. Good thing I just double checked. It's 3-to-1. So we're going to go 3 here and 3 there. So I double check. I'm used to a lot of 2-to-1 epoxies. You might have seen videos of people putting powdered pigments into their epoxy and using one of those drill stirring paddle attachments to mix it. Now this creates a really cool, satisfying video to watch, and you can get away with that when using pigments, but if you're going to go clear, it's a bad idea to use one of those drills and one of those mixing paddles. They're going to introduce a ton of tiny bubbles, so they're going to end up stuck in your epoxy. It's definitely challenging to get a clear epoxy pour without bubbles, and that's why you see so many people using color, because it really helps hide them. Now I really like the look of the clear epoxy, so there's some things that you can do to prevent those bubbles, and the first thing was to seal the edge like we did earlier. Next is going to be to pour and mix your epoxy very slowly so that you don't introduce any more of those, and then you're going to pour the epoxy slowly into the form. These casting resins do cure very slowly, so it gives those bubbles time to make their way to the surface so that you can pop them, but they're not going to make it all out, so the best thing to do is to not add them to begin with. Another thing I wanted to mention is that before you pour, you need to make sure that your form is level and on a flat surface. And again, on larger tables, you can also run a bead of silicone along that top edge of the live edge to kind of form a dam so that excess epoxy doesn't run over the middle and out towards the edges and all over the place. Now remember, I didn't seal up the bottom edge with silicone on this smaller pour, so I know epoxy is going to eventually make its way back to the back and sides. So I just took a syringe and filled up those voids right away so that I don't have to keep coming back and adding more epoxy to that center section as the level drops when epoxy finds its way and spreads out to all those nooks and crannies. Casting resins usually take about 2 to 3 days to cure, so once that's done curing, I can remove it from the form. I try to clean up the sharp edges and give it a rough sanding to help flatten it first before I run it through my thickness planer until it's flat. On a larger table, I would take it to my local hardwood dealer and have them run it through their giant planer and sander combo machine, but if you don't have access to that, you can flatten it by hand with either a hand plane or build a router sled to flatten it, and then you'll finish sanding it by hand. Then I'll take a hand plane and joint one of the long edges so that I can ride that against my table saw fence to cut the other edge nice and straight. And then on this small type of top, I can use my cross-cut sled to cut both of the ends flat and square. On a bigger top, you can use a track saw or a circular saw with a guide that's clamped to it to cut the sides and ends. Now I'm just going to make a nice little edge profile using my hand plane, but you could use a router and whatever router bit you want.
And then this just has a decent little curve, so we're just going to use this. Nice little curve there. And then when we're done, we'll put a little chamfer at the top.
Here I'm chamfering the back edge straight to my line so that when I come at it from the other direction, I don't get any tear out or blowout. Once I get the profile I like, I'll sand up to 320. I did these edges in the wrong order. Really should do the long grain first and then do the end grain, and that'll really help prevent tear out. But I really like how this edge profile turned out. It just goes to show you can do a really nice, elegant, simple profile with just some hand tools. For most projects where I'm using epoxy, I like to sand up through the grits to 320 and then just use Danish oil as my finish. This leaves a really nice frosty matte kind of look to the epoxy, and if you have any bubbles or defects, that frosty look will help hide those and clear, but if you're using color, it doesn't really matter. Now you can really apply whatever your favorite finish is, and you can even make it gloss, but like with any finishing technique, it's always a good idea to do some test pieces first before you try it on your finished good piece. Well everyone, thanks so much for watching. I really hope this video helps you on your next epoxy river project, and I really hope that you make this jewelry box. And remember, if you want to see the full build video of this jewelry box, make sure you head over to my YouTube channel and check that out. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.